In the winter of 1879, a Catholic priest named Father Emilio Carasas was summoned to a brownstone mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York City. He was not told why. He was not given the name of the man who had sent for him. He was only told that the matter was urgent, that the man inside was dying, and that whatever was said between them must never leave the room. Father Karras was 36 years old. He had spent the last decade ministering to immigrant communities in the 10th Ward, the slums, the tenements, the neighborhoods where men came home from 12-hour shifts in the rail yards and the garment factories and ate bread they could barely afford and sent their children to bed hungry. He knew suffering. He thought he understood where it came from. What he heard that night changed everything he believed about the world and how it worked. The man in the bed was not a nobleman. He was not a politician. He was a financier, one of perhaps 8 men in the United States who at that moment quietly controlled more of the country's money supply than the federal government itself. He was worth, by contemporary estimates, somewhere between $40 and $60 million. In 1879, that was a number so large most Americans could not meaningfully comprehend it. He had helped engineer 3 separate financial panics in the preceding 20 years. He had bought judges, he had bought senators, he had, by his own admission in that darkened room, helped design the invisible architecture of poverty that made his wealth not just possible, but mathematically inevitable. He confessed all of it. Father Karras listened. He did not speak. He administered last rites. He left the building before midnight, stepped into the freezing air of Fifth Avenue, and walked 9 blocks before sitting down on a curb and weeping. He kept that confession for 31 years. He died in 1910, having told no one, not his bishop, not his closest friend, not the investigative journalists who came to him in the early 1900s, as the muckraking era opened up and men like Ida Tarbell and Lincoln Steffens began peeling back the gold leaf from the Gilded Age. But he did not destroy what he knew. He wrote it down. And what he wrote down, discovered in a sealed box in the archives of a Franciscan monastery in upstate New York in 1961, is one of the most extraordinary economic documents of the 19th century. Because what the dying financier confessed to Father Karras was not merely personal sin. It was a system. It was a plan. It was, in his own words, the quiet and deliberate construction of an America in which poverty was not an accident of fate, but a manufactured condition, engineered with the same precision one might use to build a railroad or a bridge. This is the story of what Father Karras heard, and this is the story of why for nearly a century no one wanted you to know it. If this is the kind of history that doesn't make it into textbooks, consider subscribing. This channel exists for exactly this, mind, the economic decisions, the backroom agreements, the quiet architecture of systems that shape the world you were born into. Hit subscribe before we go any further. And stay until the end, because what the financier confessed in the final section of Father Karras' document is the part that has never been publicly discussed before. To understand what Father Karras walked into that night, you need to understand what 1879 actually was. The history you were likely taught describes the Gilded Age as a period of explosive American growth. Railroads stitching the continent together, factories roaring to life, immigration bringing millions of new Americans through the gates of New York Harbor. All of that is true. The Gilded Age was, by almost any measure, a period of unprecedented material expansion. What you were probably not taught is that it was also the longest sustained depression in American history. The Long Depression began in 1873 and did not fully end until 1896. 23 years. 2 decades during which real wages for American workers fell consistently. Unemployment in industrial cities ran at 15 to 20% in the worst years. Thousands of small banks collapsed, and the gap between the wealthiest Americans and everyone else grew at a rate that would not be matched again until the 1920s, and then again after that until our own era. The Panic of 1873 was the trigger, but the Panic of 1873 did not happen by accident, and this is where Father Karras' document becomes something more than a historical curiosity. The financier lying in that Fifth Avenue bed had been in 1873 one of perhaps a dozen men who held meaningful control over the flow of railroad bonds through the American credit market. Railroad bonds were, in the 1870s, roughly analogous to what mortgage-backed securities were in the 2000s, the instrument through which massive amounts of capital moved, through which ordinary people's savings were aggregated into the hands of a small number of men who made decisions about where that capital went. They were complex enough that most investors did not understand them. They were trusted enough that most investors did not question them. And they were leveraged to a degree that, when the moment came, guaranteed that any significant correction would not be a correction at all. It would be a collapse. The financier told Father Karras that the collapse of 1873 was not a surprise to the men at the top of this system. He told him they had seen it coming for at least 2 years. He told him that some of them had positioned themselves accordingly, quietly liquidating their exposure to the riskiest instruments, converting paper into gold, moving wealth into forms that would survive what was coming. And he told him that none of them had warned the public, the smaller banks, the ordinary depositors, or the federal government, because warning the public would have collapsed the market prematurely before they had finished protecting themselves. And because, and this is the part that Father Karras underlined 3 times in his document, a panic that cleared out the small players, that bankrupted the regional banks and the small manufacturers and the over-leveraged farmers, was not a catastrophe from their perspective. It was an opportunity. When the banks started failing and the railroad companies started defaulting and the unemployment lines started forming in the cities, the men who had positioned themselves correctly moved in. They bought distressed assets, failing rail lines, land, mineral rights, manufacturing capacity, at fractions of their real value, systematically, across multiple sectors. And they emerged from the Long Depression not poorer, but vastly, structurally, generationally richer. Father Karras Bitan recorded the financier's exact language at this point in the confession. The translation from the priest Italian reads like this. He said to me, and I write this as precisely as I am able, that the difficulty of poverty is not its existence but its usefulness, that the man who owns nothing will work for any wage, that the man who has lost everything will not organize, will not demand, will not refuse. He said this not as confession, he said it as instruction, as though I were a student and he, even dying, was still a teacher of these things. That sentence, the difficulty of poverty is not its existence but its usefulness, was written by Father Emilio Karras Paz in a sealed document in 1879. It would not be read by another human being for 82 years. The question Father Karras spent the rest of his life with was one that does not have a clean answer. He was a priest. What happened in that room was confession. The seal of the confessional is, in Catholic doctrine, absolute. A priest who violates it is excommunicated. There is no exception for magnitude, for consequence, for the number of people harmed by what he has heard. So he could not speak, but he could not simply carry it without form. This is perhaps why he wrote it down, not to expose it, not to use it, but to give it a shape outside his own mind, to make it real enough on paper that he could hold it at arm's length and examine it without it consuming him. The document he produced is not a denunciation. It is not journalism. It is something closer to a theological meditation. A man trained to believe that all suffering is ultimately meaningful, all sin ultimately redeemable, wrestling with the confrontation of a system that had converted suffering itself into a financial instrument. He returned to the 10th Ward after that night. He continued his ministry among the immigrant poor. He watched them organize tentatively, terrifiedly, in the early union movements that the newspapers called communist and the factory owners called criminal. He watched them get broken. He watched the Pinkertons come and the strikes fail and the workers go back to whatever terms were offered, because the alternative was hunger. And hunger, it turned out, was always available as a tool of negotiation. He knew now that this was not coincidence. He knew now that the hunger was structural, that the leverage employers held was not a natural condition of the market, but a deliberately maintained state. One that required, as the man in the bed had told him, the periodic destruction of savings and employment to keep workers from accumulating the kind of security that would make them unafraid to refuse. The Long Depression in this reading was not a failure of the market. It was the market working as designed. This is the revisionist claim, and it is the claim that mainstream economic history has the most difficulty absorbing, not because the evidence for it is weak, but because accepting it requires accepting something very uncomfortable about the relationship between economic systems and the people who design them. The conventional account treats the distribution of pain during economic crises as essentially random, as something that falls wherever it falls, unfortunate but not designed. And what Father Karras's document suggests, what a close reading of the economic record of the 1870s through 1890s strongly supports, is that the pain was not randomly distributed. It fell on specific people in specific ways for specific reasons, reasons built into the structure of the system itself. Here is something that almost no one learns in school about American money in 1879. The United States did not have a central bank. The first bank of the United States had been shut down in 1811. The second bank had been destroyed by Andrew Jackson in 1836, a fact Jackson considered his greatest political achievement, a blow struck for the common man against the concentrated power of Eastern finance. Jackson's victory has been celebrated ever since in exactly those terms. What is discussed less often is what replaced the second bank and what that replacement actually meant for the people Jackson claimed to be protecting. What the country had instead from 1836 until 1913 was a system of national banks, privately owned, federally chartered, loosely regulated, that collectively controlled the money supply. In theory, this was competition. In practice, by the 1870s, it was something closer to coordination. A cartel without a name, without a charter, without any formal structure that could be identified or challenged, and therefore without any accountability whatsoever. The major New York banks held reserve deposits from regional banks across the country. When New York called in its loans, the regional banks had to call in theirs. When New York tightened credit, credit tightened everywhere. When New York decided that the currency supply needed to contract, it contracted. And the effect was felt in every farm, every workshop, every small retailer from Pennsylvania to California. The farmers in Kansas did not know the names of the men who had made this decision. They only knew that their loans were being called and the grain prices were falling, and the bank in town was no longer lending. They experienced it as weather. They were not wrong to experience it that way because they had no mechanism, legal, political, or practical, to discover that it was anything else. The financier in Father Karras's account had spent decades at the centre of this system, and what he described to the priest that night was the degree to which the contraction of credit, the single most powerful lever anyone could pull in a 19th century economy, was not a neutral act, was not a response to impersonal market forces. It was a choice made by men who understood the consequences in advance. The argument about whether 19th century financial panics were manufactured or merely tolerated is one that economic historians have circled for 150 years without resolution. What makes Father Karras's document unusual is not that it adds to this debate. It is that it removes the hypothetical from it, because the man in the bed did not say that he and his associates had failed to prevent the panic. He described a decision. He said, and here Father Karras's Italian becomes precise and almost legalistic, that the question was discussed among the principal men, that options were considered, that the option of intervention was available and rejected, and that the rejection was based on a calculation about who would benefit from what came after. This is the confession, not a secret plot to cause a panic, something more subtle and more damning than that, a decision made by the men with the most power to shape outcomes to allow a catastrophe to proceed because the catastrophe served their interests. This is perhaps the most important thing Father Karras gives us, not the specific economic mechanics, though those matter. What he gives us in the portrait of this dying financier is a window into a worldview that has never had any reason to explain itself publicly. The men who designed and operated the financial architecture of the Gilded Age were not theatrical villains. Many of them funded hospitals and universities and public libraries. Several of them were, by the standards of their time, considered generous and even pious. They simply did not experience the consequences of their decisions as consequences. They experienced them as outcomes. The way a weather forecaster might experience a storm they predicted correctly, with professional satisfaction perhaps, but without personal grief for the people the storm caught in the open. Father Karras calls this in the document the great numbness, the condition of men who have moved so far from the actual texture of human life that suffering becomes abstract, a variable in a calculation rather than a reality, with faces and voices and children who go to bed hungry. And here is where Father Karras's document becomes something more than history, because the great numbness is not a historical phenomenon. It is a structural one. It is produced by systems that concentrate decision-making power in the hands of people who are insulated by their wealth and position from the consequences of their decisions. The priest understood this intuitively. He was not an economist. He was a man who spent 30 years watching the people the system processed from below, and one night he sat in a room with the man who had helped design it from above. What he saw across that gap was not evil. It was distance. The distance that power creates between those who make decisions and those who live inside the consequences of those decisions. And he understood with a clarity that took him the rest of his life to fully articulate that this distance was not a bug in the system. It was a feature. Because a man who felt the hunger of the 10th Ward could not have made the decisions that were made in that brownstone on Fifth Avenue. He would have been too disturbed. He would have found another way. But a man sufficiently insulated from hunger could look at the available options and choose the one that was most profitable without any psychic cost, because the cost was not paid in any currency he could feel. This is why Father Karras kept the confession, not to protect the man, but because he understood that exposing one man would not change the system that produced him. And the system, its logic, its mechanics, its indifference, is what he needed someone to eventually understand. The sealed box that surfaced in 1961 was found by a young archivist named Sister Maria Concetta Russo, who was cataloguing the papers of a deceased Franciscan brother in a monastery outside Syracuse, New York. The brother had been Father Karras's last surviving close associate, a man the priest had trusted with the physical document, but apparently not with its contents, since no record exists of the brother ever having read it. Sister Russo read it over the course of 3 days. She then took it to the monastery superior, who convened a small council of Franciscan scholars who debated for 6 months what to do with it. They did not publish it. They sent a précis to 3 American historians, one of whom, a Columbia University economic historian named Professor Aldous Ferris, travelled to the monastery to review the original document in 1963. He spent 2 weeks with it. He wrote a private memorandum to the Franciscan Council. The document appears authentic. Its implications for our standard understanding of the Panic of 1873 and the Long Depression are significant. Publication would require considerable preparation and would likely generate substantial controversy. I recommend a careful scholarly process before any public discussion. Professor Ferris died in 1967. The careful scholarly process he recommended was never undertaken during his lifetime, and after his death the momentum for it dissipated. The document was examined formally again in 1987 by a team of historians commissioned by the Franciscan Order, who produced a report acknowledging the document's authenticity but describing its economic claims as unverifiable based on existing corroborating evidence. This is technically accurate. It is also a remarkably narrow way to frame what the document contains. The economic claims are unverifiable in the same sense that any private conversation is unverifiable. There were only 2 people in the room, and one of them died before morning. The claim that powerful men made decisions about the panic of 1873 that prioritized their own interests is not historically implausible. It is historically supported by a considerable amount of circumstantial evidence. It simply lacks a signed document, which of course is precisely what Father Karras' account is, except that the man who signed it was heard only by a priest under seal of confession, which is exactly the condition under which such a man might have told the truth. The economic architecture of the Gilded Age did not simply produce inequality, it reproduced it. This is the distinction that revisionist economic historians have been trying to articulate for 50 years, that the mechanisms of wealth accumulation were self-reinforcing, that the families who emerged from the long depression with their wealth intact did not merely do well afterward, they did better and better, generation after generation, in ways that had less and less to do with individual genius or effort, and more to do with the structural advantages that initial accumulation conferred. The financier told Father Karras that the men at the top of the system never discussed their choices in terms of winners and losers. They discussed them in terms of necessity, what had to happen for the system to function, what the market required, what conditions were unavoidable given the nature of capital and credit and growth. They told this story not only to the public and to the politicians whose decisions they were purchasing, but to themselves. They believed it, most of them. The story of necessity is the most powerful story available to people who benefit from a system because it transforms a choice into a condition, an agency into a force of nature, a responsibility into an inevitability. Father Karras was not fooled by the story of necessity because he had spent 30 years watching its human consequences in the 10th Ward. He knew what the necessity felt like from the inside of it. He knew in a way that the men on Fifth Avenue could not know what the actual price of the necessity was, and now he knew who was collecting it. Father Karras does not resolve his 30-year reckoning neatly. He does not arrive at peace. He arrives at something more honest than peace. He writes near the end of the document something that Sister Russo found memorable enough to transcribe separately in her own notes. It is not enough to know that men do these things. It is necessary to ask why the systems allow them to. Systems do not build themselves. They are built by choices, small choices, large choices, choices that are invisible because they are mistaken for nature. The decision to allow men to purchase the outcomes of elections, the decision to treat corporations as persons and persons as variables, the decision to permit the control of credit to rest with those who benefit most from its restriction. These are not natural conditions, they are chosen ones, and what is chosen can be chosen differently. This is the claim that the 1987 Franciscan Commission described as moving beyond historical testimony into political advocacy and therefore outside the Commission's scope. It is also almost certainly the reason the final third of the document has never been formally published, because Father Karras is not making a merely historical claim. He is making a structural one, that the suffering produced by the economic systems of his era was not the inevitable cost of progress, but the manufactured byproduct of specific recoverable decisions. That different decisions were available, that the choosing of those different decisions is a human possibility and not a utopian fantasy. The document is held today in the archive of the Franciscan province of the Holy Name in a climate-controlled vault in New Jersey. A partial transcription, covering the first two-thirds, was published in an academic journal focused on American Catholic history in 1994. The final third has never been formally published. It has been read by perhaps 40 people in total. The reason given for not publishing the full document has changed over the decades. In the 1960s, it was the need for careful scholarly preparation. In the 1980s, it was the unverifiability of the economic claims. In the 1990s, it was a question of whether the theological sections of the document, published without context, might generate misunderstanding about Catholic teaching on the seal of confession. None of these reasons is exactly false. None of them is exactly the whole story either. What the document represents, its real friction with anyone invested in the standard account of 19th century American economic history, is not any specific claim about any specific man. It is the posture it takes, the refusal of the story of necessity, the insistence that the systems were chosen and can be chosen differently. The testimony from someone who heard it directly from the source, that the men at the centre of the system knew exactly what they were doing, understood the human cost of it, and continued because the cost was paid by people who were not in the room and could not in any practical sense object. That their primary mechanism of self-protection was not secrecy, the things they did were not hidden precisely, but the story they told about it. The story that made the question of accountability seem naive, sentimental, beside the point of serious economic analysis. The story that what happened was not a choice, but a condition, and conditions cannot be held responsible for themselves. The priest is not a hero in the conventional sense. He did not act on what he knew. He maintained the seal. He returned to his parish and lived out the rest of his life inside the knowledge without resolving it into action. Whether this was spiritual integrity or moral failure is a question he never settled to his own satisfaction. What he was, at minimum, was a witness. One of a very small number of people who have ever sat in a room with someone who helped design the architecture of economic inequality and heard them describe it plainly, without the protective coating of necessity, without the story that makes the choice invisible by pretending it was never made. He had no power to change what he had heard. He had no platform to broadcast it. He had only the pen and the sealed box and the faith, perhaps unreasonable, perhaps not, that the box would eventually matter to someone who had the tools to do something with it. What he chose to do with that witness, to record it, to preserve it, to leave it for someone else to find, is itself a kind of act. Not loud, not immediately consequential, but persistent. The document exists. It has been read. You now know it exists and what it says and what that means for the standard story of who built the American economy and why it was built the way it was. This is what the last priest who heard a giant's confession carried to his own grave. And this is what he buried it with, the hope that the box would eventually be opened, that someone would eventually read it, that the story of necessity, which the men in the Fifth Avenue brownstones had relied on for so long, would one day have to compete with a different story. The story of choice. That story is older than Father Karras. It is older than the Long Depression. It has been suppressed and recovered and suppressed again more times than any one document can account for. But it has never been fully extinguished, because the people who need it most, the people who live inside the consequences of choices made far above them, in rooms they will never enter, have always found a way to pass it forward. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is built for. Every video we make starts from the same premise Father Karras's document starts from, that the official version of events is not the complete version, and that the gap between those two things is where the most important history lives. Subscribe if you want to keep finding that history together, and if this video landed for you, share it with one person who would care about what it's saying. The algorithm will not surface this kind of content on its own. The only way it reaches the people who need it is person to person. That has always been true. It was true in Father Karras's time too.